after the brilliant talk before. So I have to warn you, this is originally a 75-minute talk, which I'll try to comprise in about 45 minutes, which I won't succeed in. Hey, I'm an agile developer, so I'm used to deadlines, and I never make them anyway. So, but I'll try to squeeze it in 45 minutes if I can. Okay, so this is actually a talk about frameworks. I'll skip my introduction. You can read that in the slide decks, and Osha already introduced me anyway. So basically, I have 5 talks at the conference. Today 2, tomorrow 1, and 2 on Friday, again on the 3rd day. That's on Thursday, actually. They all have different subjects, but they're pretty much aligned. So if you see all 4 of them, because there's one double, then you'll probably get the whole picture of what I usually do in my daytime, which is usually sit in projects, code a lot, and coach a lot, stuff like that. So just to remind you, I come from a very, very, very small country, which is even small in the slides. It's the blue one. It's called the Netherlands. I'll just do a brief introduction of the Netherlands for you. First of all, we're famous for our windmills, of course, as you all might have known. Oh, this is very good. Doing India introduction to the Netherlands. It's good. So, and we know for Amsterdam, of course. Everybody knows Amsterdam, and it's different districts that we have there. To leave them nameless, but they're named after colors. And and then we're, of course, very famous. This is actually my favorite painting in the whole world. It's in Amsterdam in a museum. It's by Vincent van Gogh. Very famous painting. And we're known for tulips. And we're known for other plants as well. And this is actually my backyard, of course. So I'll leave you that. That's my background. That's where I come from. But this is a story about frameworks. I very, very, very much like frameworks. I actually very much like writing frameworks. That's actually my favorite pastime over the past 30 or so years. So I've been doing a lot of this stuff anyway. So frameworks are good. Essentially, they are good. But this talk is not about how good frameworks are, and I'm not going to talk about how good any of these frameworks are or how bad they are or whatever. So any examples I use are just examples. Because using frameworks, you can still get into a lot of trouble. And I'll try to demonstrate some of this trouble you can get into and some very small patterns that you might help to move out a little bit of these problems. So that's all in the next 45 minutes. So let me start a bit about frameworks first. So frameworks, essentially people use frameworks to make life more easy. To have to write less code, to be able to write more maintainable code. And that's a good thing. And I did a little research. This was actually my first survey online, so I added some questions to it, like, what benefits do you have from applying frameworks? And most people say, well, because of frameworks, we develop software faster. And that's basically a good thing. Because if you're able to deliver faster, you'll be able to make it on time. Other than this talk, but most projects will be able to deliver on time using frameworks. So that's a good thing. Even managers might think this is a good thing, because you deliver much more on time. But with using frameworks, a number of questions come up. For instance, what are you going to use? I'll have a sip of water first. A lot of people and a lot of organizations say, if you're in the Microsoft space, we use Microsoft-only technology. And that's a choice you can make. It's not a good choice. It's not a bad choice. It's just a choice. And there's a lot of people say, you know what? We love the stuff that comes out of the open source. Like there's a lot of people using nHibernate, for instance, which is a very good framework for doing persistence. And it's good. And there's also a lot of people who say, okay, there's a whole bunch of frameworks out there, but outside of these frameworks that are already available, we still need to do some extra stuff. And what you will see is that a lot of projects and a lot of organizations start developing their own frameworks. And as an addition to existing frameworks, or as a replacement, or as an umbrella over other frameworks, there's different goals for doing that. So there's different types of frameworks. And then it comes with a number of questions. Once you start using frameworks, there's a lot of stuff you need to do. So I added a bunch of questions like, what are you going to do? What difficulties arise if you start implementing frameworks? Well, first of all, you have to find out which frameworks are useful for your project. And that's a hard thing. I'll show you that in a minute. Or convincing the management, for instance, that a framework is really necessary for this project. And that's a hard thing because managers, they look different at the world. I hope you're not all managers. I'm I hope you all write code or stuff, but managers look at it different. They look, what's the ROI? What's my return on investment? And then you say, well, the framework is for free. It's open source, or it's by Microsoft and it's free. And they're still doubting. And, well, for some reason. I'll show you the questions in some slides. First of all, I'm a movie addict, so that probably displays this slide. So, first of all, you have to choose what frameworks you're going to use in your projects. And there's all kinds of different frameworks. There's frameworks that cover it all. Like Microsoft Enterprise Library is a set of frameworks that do a whole bunch of stuff for you. And there's other stuff out there that also does the same thing, like the Spring frameworks. Or we have our own libraries that do a whole lot of stuff. Or a framework called Naked Objects also does a whole lot of things for you. And then there's frameworks that target a specific layer, if you use a layered architecture, that target a specific layer, like for instance deal with persistence, or deal with getting your data out on your web pages or your screens or whatever you do, or deal with, I don't know what, dealing with your process, like the UI process application block, doing MVC-like stuff, MVVM, MVP, whatever. And there's frameworks that target, let's say, a specific vertical, like dependency injection frameworks. There's a whole bunch of them out there. And they're sort of like equally good. And there's logging frameworks, of course, and there's CMSs. And there's frameworks for everything in the kitchen sink, and everything that you can think of. And there's so many choices you can make. I'll show you. This is actually, of course, the Codeplex page. And this is, actually, I took this picture, now, I think, a few months ago. And there's over 9,000 different projects on Codeplex. So think of this. You think, I need a framework for whatever you want to do. And you go to Codeplex and you say, there must be a framework out there that solves my issue. Well, there's not one framework that solves the issue. There's a whole bunch of frameworks that solve the issue. And if this was your only place of choice, it isn't. There's lots of places to choose from. Like, there's other websites. These are just arbitrary examples of websites with frameworks. Or you can choose the Enterprise Library blocks. Or you can go to the Castle project. That also has a whole bunch of frameworks out there that are really good stuff. And basically, if you look at frameworks, they'll make great promises. Like this website. You know, I anonymized this website because I first took a picture of a website of a certain framework, which I didn't know of. And then the vendors start complaining to me that I had it on my slides. That's the issue when you get filmed, of course. So let me read out loud for you what this says. This is actually from a framework website. It says, blah, 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 is an open source web application framework based on Microsoft.NET and something else, which I won't tell what it is. The aim for blah, 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 is to make life easier for system developers by providing a highly competent component toolkit that increases productivity and the quality of the system. Isn't that good? That feels like something you want to use. Well, this is actually an arbitrary website of an arbitrary framework. Every framework out there makes the same promises. And it reminds me a bit of an advertisement I saw in a Dutch bus stop. This is in Dutch, so you won't be able to read it, I guess. It says, use this shampoo, you will have 86% less split hairs. 86? What do you mean 86? Isn't it 85 or 84? That's sort of like the same metaphor. Frameworks don't do it all for you. You still have to do a lot of work. So the next step is convincing the management. And as I said, they might have totally different ideas. You might think, oh, this saves me a lot of work. I don't have to write all this stupid code that I used to write before because the framework does all the background stuff for me, and that's good. And you think about quality, and you think about maintenance of your code. And this manager comes along and says, so what does it cost? And how much do we benefit from it in money? I don't know. How much do you benefit if you start using a framework? So it's sometimes very hard to convince the management. But suppose you will be able to do that. The next step will be is trying to understand what is in the framework. And I like the quote from the previous talk. The speaker said, well, you know, C#, if you should have comments on C#, it's not that they added new features and they moved along over time. It's that they didn't remove any features. So most of the frameworks out there, they're abundant in features. There's so many stuff in the frameworks that it's very hard to try and understand what it does. So you might think it does this. And then someone else might think it does this. And probably it does both. It's depending on the perspective and how you're going to use the framework anyway. So then the next step comes along. And that is trying to convince the other developers that this is useful stuff. You're probably all .NET developers, right? So in 2 days, there's a Java conference. So I could do the same talk, and I'll just switch sides. I won't do that, I'm a C# developer. So anyway, I just heard we moved past Java, so that's a good thing. So anyway, and after that, you need to train everybody and see that they're on the same side, and they're all using the framework in the same way. And then you think, okay, we're going to use this framework, and life will be better after this. And it might. It just might. But not in all occasions. And you think you're there, and then you know what? Troubles begin. And it's not because frameworks aren't good, because framework developers do the best they can. And the best frameworks keep on evolving over time. That's what they do. So there might be some trouble with that. And I'll try to explain a bit about the trouble you might get when using frameworks. Uh-oh. Oh, I'll screw the top on again. So, first of all, you're going to use this framework, any framework whatsoever, and it just doesn't have all the features you need from it. What do you do? So what do? You add them? You do that, do you? So that's good. We do that too. But what if you've added some features to a framework, and you're working with that, and a new version of the framework comes along? What happens to the features you implemented yourself? Are they in the framework now? Are they in the framework but implemented differently? Can you get rid of your own code and replace it by code that is now in a new version of the framework? I don't know. Depends on the framework. Depends on the architecture of the framework as well. So, and the next thing, what if someone in the project thinks that, hey, we're now using framework A, and here's a new framework. They're always new. I don't know why. Here's framework B, and it does the same thing, but much better than framework A. I've had that once in a project. It was actually a Java project, but who cares? And there was a CMS framework that they used, and out came a new framework, which was actually based on the previous one, but worked a bit differently. And they started replacing the framework that they had. Frameworks lie under your own code. So once you remove the bottom part of your application and put another one in, it doesn't work. And they actually didn't produce any new features for 3 iterations, for 6 weeks, just because they replaced the framework. And it might be better, but in some cases, it might be better to stick with your old framework as well. So there's things that happen there. What if a framework that you use contains bugs? Do they? Do you all use flawless frameworks? Well, they probably don't exist. Not even the Microsoft frameworks, who are very, very good, but there's always something that doesn't really work precise the way you do. It might be a bug, or it might be that they just think about it differently. So what if there's bugs? Are you going to solve them? Well, if it's an open source framework, you might want to solve it. And you might want to send in the code you just written so that it might be in the next version of the framework. That's good stuff. So bugs are also relevant. So what if the guy who wrote the framework, especially if it's a smaller open source framework, what if he stops working on it? We've had that in the communities with a couple of frameworks that the author just couldn't find the time anymore, and he couldn't make enough money out of producing this framework and maintaining it, because maintaining frameworks costs a lot of time, and he stopped doing that. So here you are in an internet project that runs for 2 years, using framework, and the guy who writes the framework just stops. Or if it's your own framework that you've built over the years in projects, and the guys who wrote that framework leave your company. People sometimes do. Then you're in trouble again. And the last one is that, okay, I already mentioned it before, what if a newer version comes along? What's the trouble you get in when new versions of framework come along? Well, features might be implemented differently. So you base your whole application, your whole architecture on, let's say, I don't know what, a WCF, for instance, and a new version comes along, and it works differently. What are you going to do? Change your code or not upgrade to the new version of the framework? It sort of depends on the features you need from it. So let's look at it a bit more detail. So basically the issue is, with frameworks, is that you get very dependent on the frameworks you use. So for instance, in this arbitrary picture, which I just got off the internet at some point in time, suppose the gray classes, or whatever they are they classes anyway? I don't know. The gray classes are actually the framework you're using, and the yellow classes is the stuff you wrote in your application around the framework. Will you ever be able to get rid of this framework? No, you won't. Because you're very, very, very much dependent on what this framework does, on how it works. All your code is around the framework. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. If the framework is okay, you can go on with it. But if new features are required or bugs are in there, whatever I mentioned earlier, you might want to change a bit about the frameworks you use. So here comes trouble. First of all, this is an interesting cartoon. It's actually a cartoon that is used a lot to explain Agile, but it certainly also applies for developing frameworks. There's a pig and a chicken who are going to open a restaurant, and they're questioning about how to name it. And the chicken, of course, says, well, we're going to name it Ham and Eggs. And here's the difference. Being in this restaurant, the chicken will survive. The pig doesn't. So this is the thing. The framework developers, although they do the best they can, the very, very best they can, they will never be able to implement all the features and all the requirements that you guys as framework users need. So you can always complain about frameworks that, well, they're just lacking this feature. I wish they just had implemented this feature. The same goes for, I don't know, the .NET framework itself. I just wish they had done this or this or that. And they just don't, because they're unable to target the whole audience of a framework. Although they do their very best. So that's the difference. You as application developers have to use the stuff, and the framework developers, they can come up with new things. Driven by the community, hopefully, but no, that's not always the case. So let me show you an example of this. Being dependent on a framework, this is an entity data model, of course. I suppose you're pretty much aware of what entity framework does for you. You don't have to use it. It's just an arbitrary example again. So there's an entity data model, and what entity framework does, it generates a whole lot of code under the covers for you. And if you look at that code, and this is an older version of it, it says something like this. I have this course class, which is, of course, the thing I was looking for, and it now inherits something called entity object. Entity object is sort of like the root class of entity framework. So here's my course class, and it inherits something that deals with persistence. And what entity framework does is generate a whole lot of code in there. And you might think, do I actually need all this code? And to be quite honest, sometimes you do and sometimes you don't. So if this happens, and they come up with a new version. So you're stuck to this code, and you have to use this code. And at some point in time, you might want to say, hey, this course class I'm having, and all my domain objects or business classes or whatever you use, it might not be such a good thing to have them inherit entity object. But you're using entity framework. So you're stuck with this entity object thing. So that's just an example of how you can get in trouble if entity framework changes the implementation of entity object. And here's a bunch of the code that it's just generating for you under the covers. And you might say, what am I going to do with this code? This is probably too much. Most of the frameworks are abundant in features. So I'm not saying not use entity framework. I'm saying be careful with stuff like this. Because inheriting from classes that come from the framework makes you very dependent on the framework. So the next thing. So here's something we as developers, I don't know why we do this, but we keep on using beta stuff. Who of you is using a beta framework that's not yet in production? Oh, that's good. Probably the audience here in India is different than the audience in Europe. People in Europe and in the US as well, they use it as soon as it hits the shelves, even before it hits the shelves. So for instance, at some point in time, I'll give you an example, ASP.NET MVC came out in the very first beta. And you know what people did? They started using it immediately. The very first beta. They built production systems based on a beta framework. Actually, it was in Belgium, but yeah, well, it happened anyway. And the trouble with it is that frameworks in a beta version, they're never ripe. They mature over time. They always do. There's always some people saying, oh, you never should use something like a framework before it hits version 2. Anyway, and what happens too is that frameworks, as they go along, they become very popular. They become popular once people start talking about them at conferences. You should look at all the other talks and see what new frameworks come out. And talks at conference make you so enthusiastic about a specific framework that you might say, oh, I'm going to use this next week. Are we going to get rid of all the stuff we're now building, and we're going to use this new stuff? And before you know it, this new stuff, even in beta versions, is old stuff again. Just look at this slide. How many different technologies are on here? Does anybody still use... have you ever heard of something called Dublin? Still, this Dublin was formed, I think, 4 or 5 years ago. Not more than that. And the same goes for a lot of the stuff. Do you still remember Oslo and mGrammar? It was the new technology. It was pretty much complex. It was very complex. And a lot of people didn't really understand what it actually did. So it's gone again. And that's about 4 years old. This is what happens to frameworks. The stuff that's on the left side, I put it here in, I think in October. And there's already stuff that's in the left side that will be moving to the next column. MEF, for instance. Are you using MEF? Nobody does. Or you're afraid to raise your hands. That's also a possibility, of course. But that's not a bad thing. But it's not that popular anymore as it was last year. They came up with it last year. And said, this is the great new stuff. No more dependency injection. You're just going to use MEF. And people started doing that. And before you know it, it's off the radar again. As it, probably, either if you never heard of it, or you're not using it, or you're afraid you're using it. Anyway, it's gone off the radar. This is what happens. And they come up with new stuff every day. Every vendor in the field, of course, because it keeps you busy. They come up with new stuff every 6 months. What do you mean programming Metro? I just figured out how to do MVC. And now we're moving on again? What about Razor? Razor is even in between here. How soon do you think it will happen before Razor gets a second version? Or hits I don't know, goes off the radar again? This happens to frameworks. It just happens. That's not something you can predict beforehand. So for instance, here's the project in Belgium that actually used the ASP.NET MVC framework in its beta version, and they wrote actions like this. Here's an action in it's in a controller, so there's an upcoming method, and it actually ends with render a view, blah, 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 whatever. Something like this. And they wrote a whole bunch of code. And they wrote a whole system. And then, after the beta 1 came the beta 2, and there came the release candidate, and it was finally released. And when it was released, it had changed. It had changed from the beta 1 to the version 1. That actually happens. So every of these methods that they have, every of these actions that they implemented, they changed. They didn't have the render view anymore. They just returned an action result. So they changed. So they had to change all of these methods that they had in the application because they started using the beta. And this is just stuff we do as developers. We work with versions of framework, and when a new version comes along, we might have to change the code. So, and then the next thing. Also, frameworks are dependent on each other. And this is an interesting concept. And I had these questions in my little survey. And so, which of the following open use frameworks do you use? And as you can see from the response I got from this little survey, people use Log4net, which is a logging framework. It's a good logging framework. And also, a lot of people use nHibernate. So how do you think it comes that it's these two that jump out of all the others? Why is that? Is that because they're much better than the others? I tell you why this is. It's because nHibernate is depending on Log4net directly. And that's an interesting thing. You know, I didn't figure it out until I looked at the code. So here's the piece of the code. This is code from nHibernate. And it says, protect static read-only I log equals log manager get logger. Well, this particular code and this particular interface are not nHibernate interface and classes. They're actually from log4net. So what they do in the code in nHibernate is directly depend upon a log4net. And you might think, so what's the problem? Well, there is no problem. It's just that at some point in time, there was a company that said, we are only going to use Microsoft Framework, but nHibernate is the exception. And they said, we use Enterprise Library, and in Enterprise Library, there's something called the logging block, which is also a logging framework. And they ended up with this really strange situation that they had an application that used two different logging frameworks, because they used nHibernate, so they used log4net, and on the other hand, they were forced to use the Microsoft logging block, Microsoft Enterprise Library logging block. They're both good, but having two logging frameworks in your application, it might be a bit overdone. So here's the thing. Frameworks are dependent on each other. So if you look at it, and I checked it out, there's about, I just figured out how many occurrences there were of this log manager code in the nHibernate code. And there's over 150 of them. So they're pretty much highly dependent on log4net. What if log4net changes? That means the good people at nHibernate will have to change their code again too. So there's a sort of roller coaster effect that you might have from, I'm starting using this framework, but I'm also have to start using this framework because it's underneath the other one. And that might not be the situation that you want to get into. And then the next thing is that versions. If you're using version ABC, 1, 2, 3, whatsoever of a framework, you know what happens is a new version comes along. Why? Well, because there's new features that people need in this framework and that the vendor is so kindly to provide us with. So here's the thing. Things version. Like the Rocky movies, they version as well. But there's a difference between the Rocky movies and frameworks, of course, is that frameworks tend to get better over time. So here's a quote I got from a Microsoft website. And it's not to bash Microsoft, not at all, because I love Microsoft. And they said, as we were designing Workflow Foundation 4, we wanted to address the feedback and pain points that we have gathered over the past few years from the community. That's a good thing, isn't it? They listen to us, and they actually do. And then they said, well, it's on the bottom of the page, they said, as we expanded Workflow Foundation, it became clear that the Workflow Foundation 3.x architecture just wasn't created with the above in mind. And I've seen reading this specific page in a project for a large international bank that built the whole application based on Workflow Foundation 3.5 or whatever it was. And they were looking at this and they said, well, this will actually cost us about 4 months. And there's no way we can get around this because we have to use these new features that are in WF4. So that's it. And they had to change all of their code because all of the code was built on top of one of the classes in Workflow Foundation 3, which Microsoft recommends not to use anymore. So they say, if you are currently writing workflow code, please don't use the code activity anymore. What if all your activities are based on the code activity? You have to rewrite and rewire all of this stuff. That's not something you might want to do. So here's the thing. It's about software architecture. In your applications, frameworks, it's good. Good having frameworks in your project. But what I see a lot in projects is that if you ask people about what's your software architecture, they say, well, our software architecture is actually, we do use ASP.NET MVC, we use Razor, we use Entity Framework, and stuff that's underneath and whatever we do. And then a software architecture suddenly becomes a bunch of frameworks. And to be quite honest, if an architect comes up to you and tells you this story, you might want to doubt his feeling for architecture, because architecture is not a bunch of frameworks. Architecture is something you can do in a PowerPoint slide, for instance. Wow. That's the basic version, of course, but or this one. This is one we use quite a lot. It has layers, and in these layers, there's stuff. In my user interface layer, for instance, I have pages and I have panels. And we have things called use cases. What do use cases do in code? Well, I'll explain that in the afternoon, by the way, but that's a different talk. I have domain objects and factories because we implement domain-driven design, which is basically a good thing. So we end up with domain objects and stuff like that, and we have enumerations and value objects and references, and we have gateways and service gateways and whatever. So here's stuff that's in your architecture. This is your architecture. There's no frameworks in this picture yet. So the steps you always should take, I think, I believe, is first of all, think of what the architectural requirements will be for your project. And an architectural requirement for a project is not, we're going to use nHibernate. That's a solution to a problem. But the problem isn't, should we use nHibernate or not? The problem is, do we deal with persistence? Do we have to deal with persistence? If so, then the next step comes along. So what you could do is say, well, you look at your architecture and you make a picture of it. A layered architecture. Most of you will probably use a layered architecture. And in that layered architecture, you can identify the elements that are in there, which are, in my architecture are here on the right-hand side. This is the stuff my application is made of. I have domain objects. I have a course class. I have a contact class. I have an office class, stuff that actually does that comes from the domain of the customer. And I have my use cases that specify the behavior of my application. I have my web pages that I want to show to the customer. And I have something that gets me into the database or gets me into a whole bunch of services that are out on the internet or wherever they might reside. So that's the next step. And then you can say, well, I'm going to look at the responsibilities of these individual things that are in my architecture, these elements. So for instance, what does a domain object do? Well, it probably represents a customer or an office or a contract or whatever, and run some services on that. And is looking at when it is valid or not. It can actually verify its validity. So stuff like that. You can assign responsibilities to your classes. Like the use case thing, we have them in classes, so it's a controller-like thing. It manages the interaction between the page and my domain layer. So that's the stuff it does. So all of these elements, you can describe these responsibilities for. And then the next step will be, are there frameworks that actually help me realize these responsibilities? Other than, oh, we're going to use nHibernate and we're fine. So if these domain objects need persistence, then we might look for a framework that can handle those requirements. And we'll fit it in. Other than base our application on it. Fit it in is totally different. So I'll give you some very small patterns, actually, that will help you do this. And they're actually pretty much open doors. They're pretty simple. And you probably say, oh, is this a layer supertype? Is that all it is? Yes, all it is. So a layer supertype is one of those patterns. So if you have this architecture with all these elements in it, you might want to say, hey, you know what? I'll be able to translate this into code. So if I have a domain object specified in my architecture, you might want to say, why don't I create a class called domain object in my code, in my own little framework corner of the world, call it domain object, and over time, make all the stuff that is a domain object inherit from that one. So first of all, I'll skip the text, I'll just show you some examples. First of all, if you start off with layer supertypes, you know, a layer supertype is actually, it comes from a book by Martin Fowler, by the way. It's a great invention because it doesn't do anything. I love classes that don't do anything, as long as they don't just delegate stuff, but then they're useless, usually. But you know what? If I find out that I have a contract class, I have a contact class, I have a client, I have whatever, some of these domains. And you will see, if you start building this stuff, that they will have similar functionality. They might have even some of the same code. And you might want to lift that out. You might want to say, okay, I'm going to put this in a separate class, and they all inherit from it. But what if you do it the other way around? You start off with saying, hey, I need a domain object. I have domain objects in my class, in my application, so I'm going to start off with creating a class called domain object. It doesn't do anything. The only thing I do is, if I create an actual domain object in my application, a customer class, I will inherit from the domain object. And the good thing about this stuff is that, first of all, it doesn't do anything, but it will grow on you. And you will see that most architectures do the same. Most frameworks do the same. For instance, This thing is called the controller class, which is an essential class in ASP.NET MVC. And all other controllers inherit from it. And my guess would be that they started off, but you would have to ask them themselves, with an empty controller class that didn't do anything. So what you can do with it is say, you know what, I'm going to inherit all my specific controllers from it. I'll give you another example. Because in your architecture, if you've identified these elements, these are all very good candidates for being layer supertypes in your application and in your architecture. And by doing so, you will be able to do a number of things, like inherit from your layer superclass. Well, basically, that's what you do. But you will find code in there, in this specific contact class, for instance, that you could lift up into the domain object class, and it grows and it gets richer, and it gets more behavior that it does for you. And then your quality of your code gets better. It's better maintainable. But the next thing you could do is say, you could reason about these layer supertypes. So there will be services in your application and in your architecture, and might be even in your own little framework, that deal with domain objects. And you now have a class that you can specify the interface of these services for, like save compositions. What does it do? Well, it saves a domain object and all its compositions that lie underneath it. And I can now specify it for my layer supertype. And you will see that if you slowly build up a very small, thin layer of framework yourself, that you will start by reasoning about these layer supertypes that you might have, about the pages, about the use cases, about the gateways, about the service gateways, whatever you might have in your application. So this is basically a very good structure. And it's very simple to apply. Every time you see something, you say, hey, there's a whole bunch of this stuff out there, create a layer supertype. Don't think yet about what it will do, because you don't know. You cannot know what the requirements of this domain object will be over the next few years. If I look at our own frameworks, they still evolve. And the same thing happens with stuff like C# or it continuously evolves around new insights. So you don't know all these new insights when you start with your new domain object. So that's what you do. Start off with an empty class called a layer supertype. And it's very easy to do. And thus you create a very small framework. And the next thing is it's very... Oh, that's by coincidence. I already had this slide up because those were the only post stamps I could find when I needed post stamps for this picture. A very simple other pattern. There's the case is this. Well, I'll skip the slide deck again, the text again. This is a part of my framework. It's a run method on a class called task manager, and it uses an application task, and they use the name of it actually. So what do you think application task will be? It's actually a list actually of all possible tasks I could run in my application. So people might say, hey, I'm going to put this in an enum, right? Put them in an enumeration, I can list them all, and just this is all I need from it. But the thing is, if I put this in an enumeration, and this specific method is in my own little framework, I cannot extend it. I'll give you an example of that. So for instance, here's a good example. Here's I run the select company task in my application called 84, and it goes. So this looks like an enumeration, but in fact it isn't, because the trouble with enumeration is that you cannot inherit from it. So if the enumeration is in my framework, and it has a whole bunch of tasks in there, and I create my application using a framework, then it's impossible for me to extend from the enumeration and add my own tasks to it. So here's the thing. I can do this. I can add levels, but I cannot inherit from levels and say, hey, here's my application levels, and I'm going to use those as well. So the solution most people will come up with is use a bunch of strings, a string collection. So now you can do the same, of course. You can say level service validate level, levels high, which is actually this string. But the thing is, it's specified differently. It's not specified with a type anymore, it's now specified with a string, which means I can just push in anything I like. And this is not something you want to do because you want to keep those values safe. So the thing we did is, we created a thing called a descriptor class, and it's pretty similar to the string collection, except that the difference is that the instances are not defined as strings, but they're defined as instances of the same type. So here's my application task class. And it creates a whole bunch of instances. This is the class that resides in my framework. And this is the class that some application, some project, inherits from the application task and adds its own tasks. And using this one allows me to still be sort of like a string safe, as you might call it, but still use it as a sort of inheritable enumeration. And it comes in handy in some specific cases. I'll show you another example from ASP.NET, MVC. Where is it? It should be in here somewhere. Oh, there it is. So here's the thing. In ASP.NET MVC, you specify something called an action link. And you do that to be able to click on it and go through another controller and trigger an action there. And the way these things are specified is that they use strings. So ReSharper actually recognized these. If you rename the controller, then it renames all the references to it as well, even the string references. But basically, this is not what you want to do. You don't want to put in all these strings there, because if something changes in my application, these pages won't work anymore. So you could use this. You could say, you know what, I'll create an extension method that uses a descriptor called controllers and a descriptor called actions. And just by using these, you'll be much more safe, because the location of the actual name of this controller and the actual name of the action are in one specific place. So it's a small improvement that keeps you more or less a little bit more independent of the stuff that frameworks do. And the same goes for the layer supertype. For instance, the domain object, to come back to the layer supertype, if you look at the entity object and the classes that inherit from the entity object, you probably don't want that. You probably want to say, okay, my course class is a domain object, and it uses entity framework underneath, under the covers, to be able to do persistence and whatever you do. So instead of inheriting from it, you now are able to use it. And if a new version comes along, or if you start moving from entity framework to, let's say, nHibernate or the other way around, it gives you the opportunity to do that without breaking your own code. So there's one more. You're probably all aware of what dependency injection does, are you? Because I only have about 5 minutes left, so explaining dependency injection in full detail will not be on the menu anymore. Are you familiar with dependency injection? Okay, good. So, dependency injection, in a sentence, what it does, it actually separates the interface from the implementation. Right? You write code to the interface, and then you plug in or you inject the actual implementations. And that's good stuff. That is really helpful. It is also, if you use it, let's say, if you use it too much, your code might be, for less experienced developers, might be less and less readable. We added another structure to using dependency injection, because dependency injection can actually be used in a lot of different ways. There's a lot of people using constructor injection. That is, if you create an instance of a specific class, it looks at the constructor and creates instances of all those types that are actually in the constructor itself. So that's constructor injection. Another one might be property injection. So you can set an attribute on the properties that you want to have created by your dependency injection engine. And there's another thing which I refer to usually as, let's say, manual injection. It's that what we actually do is sometimes we create a class that holds all the stuff that we want to inject. And you can do that for services like things, like validation. For instance, this is an example where we have something called an object factory, and it builds all validation policies. And if there's validation policies out there, usually in my configuration file, they are injected at this point in time. But this thing, this validation manager, it's actually a static class. So we call that a facade, or we call it a manager class. So this is how you inject the stuff. It's basically, in this case, it's in your configuration file. It could also be in your code, whatever you want to do with it. But the thing is, we created a slide pattern that does this. Like, there's the validation manager, which is a static class, and all the users of the validation manager talk to that one. And what it actually does, it creates the validation policies that you want to inject. And depending on what's in your configuration file, of course. And then you can write code to that, let's say, that static facade. And there's a specific benefit from doing that, is that you will be able to write really simple code using different implementations in the back end and keeping the code intact. So the thing is, if you use a dependency injection engine, people will have injection code all over the application. I've seen that a lot. That's not something you want to do. So for the most of the stuff, what we did ourselves is say, hey, we're going to put this stuff in a manager, like the validation manager, or task manager, view manager, resource manager, state manager, whatever you want to manage. and that has different implementations underneath, we'll put that in a manager type class. I'll show you the actual code for that. So we can actually say validation manager.validate role. Role is a domain object. What actually happens underneath, I don't know. I don't really care. There's a whole bunch of implementations that we might want to do here. Like we check all the properties for validity. We check all relationship and associations that class has with other classes. We check its children. We check whatever we want to check. And we just create validation policies that we inject. But you don't see it in your code. You don't see the injection code everywhere in your application. So you get a little bit more independent of your DI engine. Because DI engines, believe it or not, they version too. So if you're using Object Builder and you're going to move to Unity, or you're going to move to a structure map or to whatever other dependency injection, you'll be in trouble if you have this code everywhere. So that's why we kept it out and we put it out in these manager types. I mean, you can do that for a whole bunch of classes. Like, for instance, we do it for managing the relationship between views and between the tasks that are underneath, or go about resource management. Like if you have resources that not only come from a resource file, but also from a database, or from a translation database, or from, I don't know what other files you ever might want to use, you just go to your own resource manager, say, get me the resource, and it's done. So this is a step up from using dependency injection just as is, just to be a bit more independent of your dependency injection engines. So, I'll leave you to it because my time was out. I hope I've shown you a lot of warnings about frameworks. So I'm not saying don't use frameworks, because frameworks are really, really good, and it saves you a lot of time and quality and stuff. But first, it's not the frameworks that are your software architecture. You should have a software architecture of your own. Identify the layers in it, identify the elements in those layers and their responsibility, and then look for frameworks that actually fit. And then try to fit them in, except of basing your whole application on top of it. Because frameworks will change too. That's what happens in life. So, I'll leave you with that. If you have any questions, I'll be here the whole week because I've still got a few talks to do. Here's my Twitter account, and my email account is also up there if you want to email for questions. Thank you for being here, and I hope to see you in the afternoon for a slightly different talk about use cases.